Okay, looks like we are live.
Excellent.
Everything is working the way it should. Let me just double check this. I want to make sure that people can send in some questions. So, okay, great. So good evening, folks. Thank you for spending time with us on this Friday evening. If you are, just to get this out of the way first and foremost, if you'd like to send in a question, please send it into the comments in the Facebook live stream. I'm going to try to keep my questions as succinct as possible so Detective Wallace can, get to answering, telling you about his book, and then we can save some time for some questions at the end. So hopefully we'll be able to get started here and do about 45 minutes and then save some time for Q&A. So I want to welcome, so I'm very excited. I'm honored to meet you. Thank you so much for making the time to come on Mythic Mission. Let me welcome you and everyone who's watching on Facebook or listening in some other way to episode number 34 and the final episode of Mythic Mission for the 2021 year, but also for our first season ever. So I've entitled this episode Investigating the Incarnation, and this is an interview with Detective J Warner Wallace about his book, Person of Interest. And so there is my paperback copy that I have marked up just a little bit. Yes, and I'm going to continue to mark it up and make notes, and I know you love to take notes. Almost a year ago, my wife Sarah and I set out to share our love of Christ and stories by creating this podcast, which is called Mythic Mission, for those of you that are tuning in for the first time. First, it grew out of the publication of my book in apologetics and a desire to use the podcast as a platform to explore the intersection of J.R.R. Tolkien's writings and the Christian worldview. It soon turned into a small ministry. It kind of got away from me and I just went with it. God led me in an area and I followed. We are grateful to all of our friends and family, to all of our guests. I just want to say a special thank you, not only to Detective Wallace, but everyone who has been part of Mythic Mission in this first season. And we are just so honored and pleased that Detective Wallace could join us tonight to send us off with a bang for season 1. If you haven't subscribed to Mythic Mission, there's a number of ways you can do that. So number 1, you can go to your favorite podcast platform. I say this because some people still, need help finding it. Number 2, YouTube channel. So for those of you who don't know, there's lots of podcast platforms, and that's what I meant by that. You have iTunes, you've got Anchor. I think there's some confusion there. So please reach out if you are having trouble finding out how to work that. You'll have plenty of ways to find us. And then last but not least, our website, www.mythicmission.com. That's all one word. We have a blog. It'll be even more active in the new year, but there's lots of stuff on the website there where you can kind of just stay up to date. So we look forward to season 2 in 2022. As I said, I'm honored and grateful to Detective J Warner Wallace for joining us this evening to discuss what I think personally is one of the most unique, powerful, and persuasive books of Christian apologetics I've read in recent years. I've done a lot of research on my own and done my own book that touches on this topic, and I'm super impressed and humbled by the amount of research. And I hope that this touches someone out there in their heart and mind and opens up a whole new world for you. So let me introduce my guest. Probably needs no introduction for a lot of you. So I've been asked to keep it short so we can get into the interview tonight, which is what everybody is here for. So Detective Wallace does have a website if you want to learn more about him, and I'm sure he'd be grateful for you to visit that. I will post a link so that you can do that, as well as a link to where you can buy the book, which is just about everywhere. So to our introduction, J. Warner Wallace is a Dateline featured cold case homicide detective. He's a popular national speaker, and he is a best-selling author. And I will post some things in the show notes so you can learn a little bit more about him. So as I said, Detective Wallace, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, really glad to be here. Looking forward to the Q&A, especially. That's going to be fun.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it too.
Yeah.
And I know I actually got a couple of advanced questions. I told you you've got a family member who, so we'll get to that. So I think the first place to start, and I know I sent these to you in advance a couple of weeks ago, just tell us a little bit about your background as a detective, how long you've been doing that, and then get into how you've applied your skill set as a professional detective, your background in law enforcement, to this new book, Person of Interest. Could we start there?
Well, I followed my dad's footsteps into law enforcement. Pardon me. I wasn't really planning on being in law enforcement. I was trained classically as an artist, a designer, and then an architect. And then I was working as an architect when I decided to enter into law enforcement at about 27 years old. So
wow.
I was not even interested in studying Jesus for any reason until I was about 35. And we stepped foot in a evangelical church for the first time, really for anything other than like a funeral, maybe. And I can't remember really maybe one or two of those. And so by the time I was 35, not having been raised in the church, no Christians in my family, no experience, just kind of dropped in out of the universe, into the world of Christianity. And I heard a pastor describe Jesus as somebody who was super smart, the smartest man who ever lived, in fact. And that intrigued me enough to buy a Bible, which is sitting on my shelf back here, that started the whole thing for me. I started reading through the Gospels, kind of thinking that I would just find these wisdom statements of Jesus. Let's see why he's so smart. Only to discover that these appear to be claims about activities that actually occurred in history. Well, that kind of claim I could test. I could test whether these were eyewitness claims based on the experience I had working eyewitnesses. And I simply applied the template that we apply in the state of California for all criminal trials, especially homicides, which are the highest kind of high stakes trials you can have in the criminal sphere. And that's really what I started to do. And a lot of this was testing what's in the New Testament, but also expecting that if Jesus was who he said he was, that there ought to be a bigger ripple effect than just 4 ancient documents written in a corner of the Roman Empire by 4 gospel authors. Wouldn't you think? Absolutely. If he really was God incarnate, that there would be something more to find. And so a lot of what I'm chronicling in this book, Person of Interest, is the stuff that's outside the New Testament. The stuff inside the New Testament I've written about in a book called Cold Case Christianity. But this information is really about all the stuff that, look at it this way. I do a lot of no body murders where you don't have a body. Somebody claims that his wife ran off. I had an argument. She left. She never came back. So we take a missing persons report and nobody complains because he's convinced everybody that she just ran away. Sure. And then some period of time goes by and now we're working it as a murder because she never shows up again. And the question then becomes, well, did you take any photographs of the crime scene? Well, no. Did you take a report for a murder? No, it was a missing persons case. So we have nothing booked in under the report number, nothing in property, no evidence collected, no photographs taken. How do you demonstrate what happened on the day that she went missing if you don't have any evidence from the crime scene? Well, you do it by demonstrating to the jury that if this is a murder, a bomb exploded on the day. In essence, a violent interaction between her and her husband. But every bomb is preceded by a fuse that burns slowly toward the detonation of the bomb. And after the bomb explodes, you've got shrapnel and debris everywhere. So we're going to demonstrate what happened on the day that she went missing, even though we have no body and no evidence from the crime scene, by simply tracing the fuse and the fallout. Mm-hmm. And I think the same thing could be done if you were somebody who said, what if somehow they had destroyed every New Testament? There was not a single New Testament manuscript or New Testament printed that you could actually reference to see who Jesus was. Well, it turns out the kind of person Jesus was so impactful that you could reconstruct the entire story of Jesus and know everything you need to know about Jesus from just the fuse of fallout of history, even if there was no evidence in this crime scene that we call the New Testament. Mm-hmm. That's the kind of impact that Jesus had on history. And that really is only explained a couple of ways. And so that's what we're trying to do in Person of Interest. Take a look at everything that's not in the New Testament, the impact that Jesus had, and try to figure out what is the most reasonable inference from the impact alone. And that's what we're doing in Person of Interest.
Yeah, that's a great summary. And I really appreciate the inference to the best explanation approach. I don't know if you're familiar with the work of Alistair E. McGrath, but I love his narrative apologetics. And he kind of approaches that with myth as a grand narrative, that we're trying to, instead of trying to assume the role of God and special revelation, we can prove which religion is right. God's already done that. He's come and he's shown that. And so we should be looking for the myth, the story, the big story that makes sense, kind of like a hypothesis or I suppose, you have a hypothesis about how a crime was committed as well. And, you kind of say, well, this is the one that makes the most sense of the data. You don't fudge the data to make it whatever you want. You look at it and you try to fit it, and if you have to change it, you do. And so it's interesting, I think, to approach it in this way. I think people are going to really find it a fresh and compelling approach. And I know that you have a lot of great sidebars in the book that explain some of the criminology terminology, and for those of you that are not, what is a no body homicide, what is a person of interest. And I see that you've touched a little bit already on my second question. But I'd like to spend just a little bit more time. I don't know if there's anything else you think we need to say about the fuse and the fallout and the chapter 1 material. Yeah. So if you think there's anything else we can unpack there, great. That was where I was going to go next. So you started to touch on that. But I think what's going to be really compelling for people is especially I know certain family members, we can reconstruct the life of Jesus of Nazareth without the New Testament. It's that this man was that significant. He made that explosive an impact that there's all this data that we can compile, even from, as you say in your book, enemies and people who are just not a fan, to say it very mildly, of Jesus Christ, which I think is compelling. So can we get into that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I think about that for a second. This is the kind. It's not going to be easy to erase Jesus of Nazareth from collective memory of humans in history, given the impact he's had. And it's hard to explain why that would be the case. There used to be, and we're talking about the best inference from evidence, really an abductive reasoning approach.
Yes.
You got a number of evidences that are in the room, and then you got a number of explanations for those evidences. We're always comparing the evidences to the explanations and trying to find the explanation that makes the most sense, that has the least liabilities, has the best and strongest and deepest explanatory power.
Yes.
That's what we're doing in abductive reasoning at every death scene, trying to determine if that death scene is in fact a crime scene. Well, the same thing happens here. And it used to be years ago that C.S. Lewis kind of offered the trilemma that's now become famous, that liar, lunatic, or Lord. I think the times have changed a little bit, and the complaints and issues and the skepticism has risen related to who Jesus might be. I think the trilemma is a little bit different, and we're trying to, I wish I would have added this to the book, but it struck me afterwards, that's what we're really doing. The trilemma really is Jesus a myth? Never really existed, a work of fiction. Of course, C.S. Lewis assumed that this was already settled, that nobody was going to make that level that complaint going forward. But of course, in the last 50 years, 30 years, especially, you have seen this attack on the historicity of Jesus, that he is nothing more than a copycat savior from other prior myths. So that's one of the things you see a lot now. So the second, that's the first possibility. He's just a myth. Second possibility is that he is just a mortal, just a human who lived in the first century. And the third possibility is that he's something more. He's God incarnate who has come into his creation. Now, of those three possibilities, think about it for a second. The first one, can you think of any other myth that has had the impact? Now, of course, a lot of this is dependent upon understanding the level of impact that Jesus has had in art, literature, music, education, science, world religions. Those are the things we talk about in the fallout. And there's no mythological figure. There's no a fictional character that has had not just the kind of collective impact in terms of memory, but in terms of influence, in terms of shaping our study of the natural world in the sciences, or forming educational organizations or institutions like modern universities. So if there is no other example of a mythical figure, when I say mythical, I mean fictional in that sense. There's two ways to interpret the word myth, right? One is to say he's a fictional character. The other is to say it's just a description of deity. But there is no fictional character that's ever impacted human history. So it's reasonable to infer that Jesus is something more than a fictional character. We can't imagine how a fictional character could accomplish such a thing. But secondly, there is no other mortal in the history of mortals who's had this kind of impact. And that's why I think it's a reasonable inference that he's something more than a mortal. The third option, that he's God incarnate entering into his creation, would account for the kind of impact that I'm seeing in those 5 or 6 areas of human history that matter most to us. So that's why I think that this is, we are doing abductive reasoning here. We're saying, hey, given the evidence, which explanation has more explanatory power?
Thank you. Yes, I think that's a very powerful. I don't want to mean a counter argument. I suppose it is to a strong skeptical view that we can't really know. And hidden in that statement, of course, is that we can know that we can't really know. So I think that this is that is the abductive approach, is a really fair and judicious way of looking at the evidence and kind of saying we're not claiming too much, but we're also not claiming too little, that there is evidence to support this. And I love that. And we'll get into this, but I want people to think about all the kind of, pre-Christian mythological figures and religious figures from world religions that you can think of. Try to think of in the next, 10, 15 seconds, what names come to mind. I mean, what you just said, Detective Wallace, is absolutely true. As a humanities teacher, I get this question all the time at the college level, well, what about Buddha? What about Zoroaster? And if you do a deep dive, and that's really what's required, into the primary sources, your claim really bears itself out. I mean, you have to look into the evidence yourself. And so I would say you've got on page 37 of your book in chapter 3, a list of, a dozen or so figures, and I think we could even come up with more, and we would, I can't think of too many other compelling ones to add, but I think you nailed them all. So that's amazing, and a very, very powerful, argument for those of you that may be struggling with, this idea that we have to prove every bit. We're limited. We can't. This is what, God kind of came into the world to resolve that for us. And so we'll get into that, of course, here shortly. The idea is, I think too, and Detective Wallace, you probably have encountered this, that many Christians feel like they have to prove everything beyond a reasonable doubt, and they have to, have this airtight case. And abductive approach kind of, is a little humbler than that. Would you say?
Well, okay, so we do need to prove it beyond a reasonable doubt, but we cannot prove it beyond a possible doubt. So the possible doubt, that is the absolute, there's no questions left. Every single question has been answered. Every stone has been turned. Well, of course, there's never a case. I've never had a case in all of my trials, and I've never lost a case. And I've done, dozens and dozens of homicides in cases that are either robberies or homicides. And I'll tell you that I've never lost a case, but I also have never had a case in which I could actually answer every question that the jury had. So we pick jurors and we ask them up front, are you the kind of person who has to have every question answered before you can render a verdict or make a decision? Because, we do this all the time where we make decisions, and there's all kinds of possible questions you could ask about whether your car is going to explode in the driveway, whether your kids have been telling you the truth about what they did last night. At some point, we reach a level of reasonable doubt when once we're beyond there, we're like, okay, yeah, anything and everything is possible. I always say that.
Sure.
But not everything and anything is reasonable. And we don't operate on the level of possible, because if we did, we'd be paralyzed by concern and fear of what might happen. And look, we are seeing that now in the world around us with people who are operating. Are we concerned about what might happen to us, what might possibly happen to our health? Or are we concerned about what is reasonable given the evidence we have so far? And I will tell you that leads to two different ways of living. It also leads to two different ways of deciding what is true. Now, you would never, there's no way you could hold the standard beyond a possible doubt for anything, let alone for claims about God. But certainly we live every day at the standard we call reasonable doubt, which is lower. And that's all we're doing here. This is why in jury trials, you could never prove anything if the standard was beyond a possible doubt. Which you have, in fact, judges instruct jurors specifically that your standard is much lower, because the judge will say in California, I can offer any imaginary or possible doubt against anything you might believe.
Absolutely.
So that's why the standard is a lot lower. So this is to be fair. You don't hold that standard for anything, but of course you do hold it for Christianity, people who are skeptics, because they want a reason not to believe it's true, to be honest. And so that's why we have to be honest about what our standard is. And this is one of the things that I hope that our work here has done to help. This is our 8th book, and the goal here is to write books that help people understand not just what is the evidence for Christianity, but what are the rules of evidence? What counts as evidence? Well, what is the standard of proof? And these are things that a lot of us, I got a lot of books here in my shelves that are written with names that would incline you to believe they're written like evidence that demands a verdict. That's very much of a courtroom. But here's the thing I notice is that no one who writes those books has ever actually spent any time in a courtroom. And as you do that, you get a sense of what counts as evidence to begin with. And you'd be surprised to know that everything counts as evidence.
Wow.
What's in the crime scene, that counts. What's not in the crime scene, but should have been or could have been, that counts too. What did he say? That counts. What did he not say? What he could have said? That counts. Well, what did he do? That counts. What did he fail to do? That counts. You see what I'm saying?
Wow, I do. Yeah.
So that's why we want to look at the stuff for Jesus, and you will find evidence in places you may not have thought of before, because you haven't really thought maybe that would count.
Yeah.
No, it all counts.
It all counts. I have to say, this brings me back to 2008 working. I will mention my father-in-law, Kelly, having the experience of working a summer in his office, and all the terminology is kind of coming back to me, and he thinks a lot like this. And so I appreciate the rigor that you bring to this. And I think the distinction, first thing I want to say is, you said possible doubt versus reasonable doubt. And I think that terminology is going to help people kind of say, what can we reasonably expect to prove about anything as you said about your car starting, or what about the sun rising or water boiling at a certain temperature? There are lots of things that we take for granted as true every day that we don't demand, beyond possible, as you said, proof for. It's impossible to offer that kind, and it is paralyzing. I think that's very important that you pointed that out. But I do notice, especially towards the end of the semester here, we were teaching on religious pluralism. I asked my students, I said, why is it that we go after Christianity in particular for, in saying, oh, well, Christianity is intolerant or it's bigoted? I'm like, why are we going after Christ in particular? And I got some interesting responses, and I think you kind of hinted on that, a couple of people, one student pointed out, I think pretty reasonably, well, Christ made bigger claims than Confucius did, and Buddha did. Buddha claimed, I'm one who's awake, but Christ claimed to be the way, the truth, and the life, and no one comes to the Father except through me in John 14:6. So I thought that was honest. But I do notice that there's almost this bias, as you kind of hinted at, towards Christianity, that we're going to be extra skeptical towards it. And I wonder if that hidden assumption is that, well, because the claims are bigger, and so we demand more evidence. And then that leads me to my second point, kind of just responding in dialogue to what you said about, everything could count as evidence. What's there, what's not there. And I think that will really also broaden when people investigate, religions. When I go, what kind of evidence could I amount for proving the truth of Christianity? And I think it will surprise people if you start thinking about what kinds of things would count as evidence and good arguments for the truth of the Christian worldview. So I think that's going to be extremely helpful to people, including me. Just hearing you say it, it just clicks. It just makes sense. I think it just makes sense. So I'm tempted to go down this rabbit hole more, but I want to get back to a central question here, and maybe I can share some more of my student responses with you later. To the next question, you mentioned earlier about the fuse, that leads to the kind of the bomb that's going to explode, that leads to a fallout, which you cover in chapter 1. What kinds of things would you want to share with people tonight? In chapters 2 through 4, you go through the cultural, spiritual, and then prophetic fuse. And for those of you that haven't read the book yet, the cultural fuse, Detective Wallace, if you could get into this, what do you think we could share with people that's pretty compelling tonight? The cultural fuse having to do with the kind of right cultural climate and the technologies that were available when Christ came that made the spread of Christianity possible. The spiritual fuse refers to the other religions in the time before and during Jesus's life. And then the prophetic fuse kind of refers to the history of Israel. If we had to just share a few points, what do you think we could share from the triple fuse here for people tonight, the cultural, spiritual, and prophetic?
Yeah, well, I think, first of all, it's hard to describe what is largely visual. And this is why we included 400 plus illustrations in the book. We knew, I know from working with juries, also from working with Gen Z believers, we do a lot, most of my work is with high schoolers. So I do 6 conferences around the country, the reality conferences, which are for high schoolers. And I'm on staff as faculty at Summit. So that's 7 sessions, 7 immersive sessions every year that are really just dealing with high schoolers. And what I've noticed is that this glowing rectangle dictates everything now. And what's different, the reason why we upgraded our phones to begin with, the glowing rectangle, is we upgrade them because of the ability, it's not the operating systems, it's not the operating speed. I can't even tell the difference in the operating systems and the speed. We do it because, number one, screen resolution is bigger and the cameras are better. So all visual. We are highly inclined toward visual media, which is why you're probably doing a Facebook Live in addition to a podcast, right? You want to capitalize on this visual media. And I think part of that means that we're going to learn how to speak what I call as a visualish. So Zondervan was kind enough to allow me 2 years to build out the 8 stage presentations that are this book. And then I was able to take those stage presentations and turn them into a book. So this was written visually.
Wow.
And then I added the words.
Didn't know that.
So all of the research was visual. I'm thinking, how do I make a case for a fuse that is burning up to the appearance of Jesus? Well, fuses are timelines. They're visual, right? So I asked the publisher, I don't want a single page in which there isn't a list to not have an illustration. of some sort. It could be just a chapter header, but there needs to be some graphic element on every page, unless of course there's a list, because the lists kind of reorganize your page. So
Sure.
I get that, but so they allowed me to do all the interior design, and I drew all those illustrations. So for me, the idea is, how do we communicate this visually? Now we're going to talk about the fuse, but it's going to be hard to verbalize what is really a visual process. Here's what I can tell you, that in history, Paul says in Galatians that Jesus comes to us, that God sends his son in the fullness of time. And that expression, the fullness of time, I think is an interesting one, because you got to ask yourself, what does that even mean? Because you could argue anytime that God sends us anything, does anything, it's the right time, right? It's God's timing. But what's interesting is how he shapes human culture to prepare for a window of incredible impact that occurs in what we now call the first century, which was not called the first century. It isn't the first century. We're just calling it the first century because something amazing happened. So what is those? What is the timing? How does he control the history of humans to prepare the way for Jesus? Well, a couple of things. Number one, we know that there's prophecy that gives you a window of time in which the Messiah should come. Daniel 9 kind of seems to give you a pretty firm understanding, although a lot of Jews don't accept that prophecy. But clearly, Daniel's saying that Jesus is going to come between the edict to restore Jerusalem, and you can argue about when that edict occurs, and the destruction of the temple. It's kind of hard to argue that because that's already happened. So there's a window. Well, there's also a window that is based on the mythologies, all of the ancients who are thinking about the nature of God and have certain expectations of God. And as he meets those expectations most robustly in the person of Jesus Christ, he does it at a time, a window of opportunity in which the most groups are still actively worshiping the gods they have created on their own that resemble the true God of the universe, because we all have reasonable expectations. Look, if God exists, for example, he's probably going to enter the world supernaturally. He's probably going to be able to defeat death. He's probably going to work miracles. I've identified 15 commonalities between all of the ancients. None of them have any more between 6 and 10, but Jesus possesses all 15. God meets the expectations of those who are expecting him. The better that the expector meets the expectations the expected meets the expectations of the expector, the better the result. The last fuse is the cultural fuse. Now you got to kind of see this in chapter 5, I think, is the chapter in which I actually call the fullness of time. And what I'm doing there is trying to show you how, when a crime occurs, will often tell you who did the crime. Because every suspect has particular preconditions that must be met before he can do the crime, and certain deadlines he's working against. So you really have to kind of see these illustrations and how they kind of evolve in that chapter to understand why this red zone in which God appears is so amazing. From about 29 BC to about 70 AD, something's going to happen. And it turns out that right in the middle of that crazy red zone of opportunity appears Jesus of Nazareth. Now, I get it. This is going to, maybe in terms of us discussing it right here, it may sound like, well, what are you even talking about? But as you see the timelines of the fuse that's burning toward the appearance of Jesus, I think it becomes abundantly clear. And that's why I knew when I wrote this kind of book that this is such a highly visual idea that it's going to require a lot of illustrations. So we're doing our best right now with words to describe something that when I like getting ready to do a presentation tonight for a group in Seattle.
Oh, wow.
And as I do that presentation, it'll have to be visual because there's no way to describe this otherwise.
Yeah. No, I agree. And that was great what you touched on. So thank you. And I want to encourage people obviously to get the book, but it's a cumulative case. So you have to look at each illustration in its proper stage, especially in chapter 5, because you kind of show in the previous chapters in chapter 5 how each of those layers of the fuse kind of overlap in the red zone. And what's most remarkable about that chapter is, as you said, it shows that red zone in which the most abductive reasoning, again, the most likely time in which something big would happen, someone important would arrive. And just as a student of history and having studied so much Greco-Roman history in particular in college, I thrilled to the information, I think in chapter 2 about, I was like, oh man, he's using Latin. I'm geeking out, and your footnotes and, the comment about Tiberius, and really got me. I want to also encourage people, read the footnotes, please. Read the footnotes, really go into that, because there was one, I want to say it's on page 17 or so, somewhere around there in the book, where I learned something new about Tiberius trying to, what was it that you said, trying to support Christianity, or that there might be evidence to suggest that?
Well, yeah, it's really about trying to measure and compare how much data we have to prove the existence of certain individuals in history. I really think that this is, I've always said this, that the bias against Jesus is largely presuppositional, and it comes to the bias against supernaturalism. So, for example, if you had the exact same literary data that we have today,
right,
that it was describing an ancient Jewish sage who lived in the 1st century, who preached a Sermon on the Mount and preached the Olivet Discourse, but never did anything supernatural, never worked a miracle, never rose from the grave, never did anything that you would consider outside of naturalism, right?
Mm-hmm.
Just a regular guy who lived in the 1st century. Nobody would doubt the existence of Jesus, and they would argue that he is the most supported historical figure probably in the history of historical figures, given how much data we have about Jesus and given the manuscript evidence we have about Jesus. But enter one miracle, and suddenly we've got mythologies. I mean, there's no way this could be true.
No.
Well, that's not about the strength of the manuscript evidence. That's really about the presuppositional bias that a lot of academics in the last 200 years have had against anything supernatural. If Jesus is going to work miracles, well, this has to have been written late, right? Because there's no way those miracles really occurred. So therefore, I'm going to posit that every New Testament manuscript had to have been written well after the death of all of the potential eyewitnesses, because there's no way that anyone would affirm a miracle.
Sure.
Okay, that's a bias against the super. That has nothing to do with dating the manuscripts based on any manuscript evidence, or even on any internal or external evidence from history or from the manuscripts themselves. Instead, that is based entirely on a bias against the supernatural.
Absolutely agree.
So again, but at the same time, most of us who are atheists, as I was till I was 35, would tell you that, I believe there was something outside of space, time, and matter that initiates and causes everything in the universe. It creates all, or causes all space, time, and matter. That's simply just Big Bang cosmology. That's the secular view. That's still the standard cosmological model.
Yes,
but if we believe there is something outside of space, time, and matter that is the cause of all space, time, and matter, then it turns out that that's the most impressive supernatural act of all supernatural acts. If there's a being that could do such a thing, then walking on water, that's a small potato miracle. Everything in the New Testament is a small potato miracle compared to create everything from nothing.
Nothing. Yeah.
Okay, so that's the point. And so I have to at least hold my skepticism about New Testament miracles with an open hand if I'm being fair. And that's all we're really asking the skeptic to do.
And I think that itself is fair. And I think I heard N.T. Wright say once, you have to be skeptical of your skepticism if you really want to be a thorough skeptic. And I think that's sound. I'm speechless. There was one thing I thought of when you were just going through that Jesus in the Gospels, I think, anticipates that, you better hope that this doesn't all happen, what I'm describing about the temple, in winter, when we know that if it had been written late, Jesus would have gotten that wrong, because we know the temple was actually burned down by the Romans in 70 AD in the summer. I think it was July or August, one of the two. I think it was August. And so it's interesting, little details like that just show that in addition to what you said about presuppositions or assumptions against,
well, this is why a lot of skeptics will not date the Gospels anytime prior to 70 AD. There's no way that Jesus could predict something supernaturally. It has to have been written after we already knew the outcome. But that's not based on because we have some manuscript that demonstrates this is the case.
That's right.
It's based on the fact that we don't believe anything supernatural could ever occur.
Well said.
So you're already assuming the conclusion you're trying to determine by way of evidence.
Yep. Not a very rational or logical approach. So it kind of fails to live up to its own standards there. Okay, that's great that we went on that tangent. I think that was very helpful. So thank you. A very, very important one. In the time that we have left before I check on with my wife here to see if there's any questions. I know I have a couple that I told you about in advance, but we've started to touch on this. But you mentioned the 15 sort of characteristics in chapter 3 that all these mythologies prior to Christ and including Christianity too, that they all share these Messiah figures. So how compelling is this argument? I mean, so a lot of people will say, let me frame the question this way, that Jesus is a copycat Messiah, that Christianity and Christ, just borrowed from Mithraism and the cult of Osiris and Adonis and Tammuz and so on and so forth, and that it cobbled together to make this Jewish archetype, or Jewish version of the archetype. I don't see that as a very compelling argument. I don't know what you want to say about that. Can we comment on that first? I mean, does the historical evidence, even archaeological evidence you even touch on in your footnotes, does it point in that direction that Jesus is a copycat Messiah?
Well, philosophically, I think it's a bit of a stretch. I mean, if we're going to argue, think about this for a second. So you're saying to me then that Jews in the first century, the authors of the Gospels, trying to convince other Jews that Jesus is the Jewish Messiah, they cobbled together a story violating the one most adamant law, the first law of Moses, which has been warned against Jews for their entire history, that you will not have any God before mine. So we're going to take together non-Jewish pagan gods and cobble together a story in order to convince Jews who for centuries have been told they should not honor or bend their knee to pagan gods. I mean, this is seriously. I mean, I don't know what really to say to that. On its face, this is the first commandment. There is no other God before me.
Mm-hmm.
And how many times in history in the Old Testament do you see God warning his people, do not even marry into people who worship other gods? Oh yeah, but now we're going to convince you that Jesus is the Messiah, repeatedly by using Old Testament scripture, by cobbling together a story which is built on a collection of pagan myths. Yeah, that to me, okay, well, yeah, what can I say? But that also assumes that that's what happened. Here's the problem: is that if you read the pagan myths, yes, they have the 15 broad overarching characteristics are there. So for example, one of those characteristics is that the God, the myth or the deity will come into existence in a supernatural, unexpected, unnatural way. So, well, Jesus does that. Well, okay. But this is, I think, a common expectation of anyone who's thinking about God. If he can break all of natural law, if he is the author of natural law, if he can enter in a supernatural way, why, I would expect him to enter in. But if you compared Mithras, it's been said that Mithras was born of a virgin in a cave. That's like Jesus. Yeah, okay. It's hard to actually reconstruct the story of Mithras, given that there's no written scripture about the Mithraic religion. But what we do know from the earliest reports is that Mithras emerges from the side of a mountain, leaving a hole. Okay, so how we get from that to Mithras is born of a virgin in a cave? Well, he leaves a hole, I guess. That could be good. Do you see how much you have to stretch the rules, stretch the descriptions in order to make them match Jesus? But I will say this: there are probably more, but I have identified 15 common expectations of ancient people groups. And I even show in a chapter on this how even the contemporary secular people who, like, for example, advance that the entire universe is a computer simulation. They end up reconstructing a world that looks a lot like a theistic explanation, because you can't help, if you're going to think about a transcendent reality, you end up adopting several commonalities. And these are the commonalities that all of the ancients tap into. But what's interesting is none of those, the most common characteristics are shared by Buddha, Zoroaster, Attis, and I can't remember the other one. It's in the book. Yeah. No one's claiming that Buddha is a reconstruction of a prior mythology. Well, because if you look at the mythologies, they're not that similar. Oh. Well, this is what I'm saying. That's why I wanted to show you that the ones that are the most similar, you would say, oh, no one's claiming that Buddha was copied from Attis.
Dionysus was the other one.
Yeah. So there you go. So honestly, are we saying that Jesus, it turns out that only in the broadest possible sense do we have these commonalities, but that makes sense to me. Look, C.S. Lewis puts it this way. The ancient myths, stories about God, as narratives about deity are come from the minds of men and poets of antiquity, tapping into the resources they had available to them. But Jesus is the myth from the story about deity from the mind of God, grounded in what we call real things. And this is exactly, if you think about that for a second and apply that statement to what you see Paul doing on Mars Hill. Paul says, hey, you people are very religious. You worship a lot of things that you have imagined. and even your poets. He even cites a poet
Yeah.
talking about what these people have imagined about God.
Good
And they even
dreams.
worship a God they can't even name.
Yeah.
That's an unknown God.
Mhm.
Yet we are here to tell you, and by the way, none of these mythologies are claimed to be eyewitness accounts about that mythology.
Mhm.
He
Wow.
says, we're here to tell you what we saw with our own eyes. We saw Jesus rise from the grave.
Mhm.
That's very different. So what he's saying is you
Little
have
bit.
your stories and your myths from the minds of poets. We
Mm.
have our eyewitness observations from the mind of God.
Yeah.
And there's the difference.
It's a huge difference, and I love that you're pulling on Lewis's "Myth Became Fact" among other sources. But that essay,
Yeah.
he says that God sent good dreams to the pagan poets, and you say this, I think, later on page 47. If there is a God, and I'm quoting you here, and he wanted to evoke the best possible response, wouldn't he meet the expectations of the expectors? So wouldn't that make sense that God, if he wanted to make himself known, if he wanted to prepare people's hearts and minds, imaginations and faculty of reason, he would send good dreams to all the people of the earth. We're all made in God's image.
Absolutely.
And that's so powerful. And you go on to explain this on page 47, but it's just a simple statement. But if God really wanted to show himself, wouldn't he do it in a way that conforms to the kind of ways in which that we conceive of deity? By the way, I think this
Well,
also
how do we even expect humans to think about? Humans have been created in the image of God.
Yeah.
And so this is why when they think godly thoughts, they capture some realities, they capture some truths.
Yes.
Now, of course, a lot, and we see this in scripture, a lot of what can be known about God can be known from the natural revelation. This is why Paul says that no one's got an excuse in Romans 1. This is why King David writes about this in Psalm 19. You can know a lot about God. You can know that he exists. You can know about the power of God just from the natural environment. So why would you be surprised? And this is why when we see studies today, and this is part of one of our chapters, you'll see studies today in which we're discovering that young people as a default position, they look at what appears to be created and designed, and they infer there's a creator and a designer. That's the default position. It's not atheism amongst children. Wow. The default position is some form of theism. According to the studies, these are all usually Ivy League studies that I published in the book. These are studies that demonstrate that atheism is the acquired position. You start off thinking, yep, I see some design features. There's probably a designer. Wow. At some point, somebody talked you out of it.
Yeah, I think that's very powerful. And I can hear some of my friends kind of saying, oh, that just seems all very proper, but what a conspiracy, Christianity must be true. And you're assuming that, if we have these intuitions of a design, there must be a designer. That's just begging the question according to them. But I really think
let's put it this way. Look at it this way. I always say that I wrote about this in God's Crime Scene, a book that actually tries to demonstrate the existence of God just from the science in the universe. Sure. But let's put it this way. If I was to walk into a death scene, somebody's fallen down maybe, or somehow hurt themselves, but they're dead and there's blood spatter against the wall. How am I to interpret that blood spatter? They could have just fallen and hit their head, and just the chemistry and physics, the chemistry of blood, the physics of the droplets might account for the blood spatter on the wall. But if I get there, and instead of there just being blood spatter on the wall, there is written in the blood of the victim, he deserved it. Is it appropriate for me to infer that I've got a suspect? This is something more than a natural or an accidental. I think it is, because information is best accounted for, best explained by the existence of intelligence, a mind. Somebody who wrote that on the wall, knowing I could decode what he coded. So when I see DNA in information in biology, I can ask myself the question: can I get that kind of code? And it's always been described as a code, and I would challenge anyone to describe it otherwise. And if I can get that kind of code by physics and chemistry, then great. But codes require coders.
Yeah, coders. Yeah,
who understand the code well enough to know that the reader will be able to decode it. Which we are now doing in DNA.
Yeah.
So the reality of it is that that's a reasonable inference. It's not circular. It's not like saying, I think there's a God, therefore. Right. No, it's like, if you didn't know anything, how do you explain information on the wall? There's a suspect. That's a reasonable inference from the evidence. And that's all we're doing here.
I think that was well answered. Yeah, so I want to get to my last question, and I know there's not a whole lot of questions on Facebook yet. I'm glad some people have sent some in advance, and we can get you out of here on time with an hour. I know you have
Good.
other engagements tonight. I don't know how you find the energy, so God bless you.
Well, I will tell you this.
Yeah,
You write a book, and I always tell people that writing the book is not the hard part. Getting people to read the book is the hard part. And if
amen
you
to
didn't
that.
think it was worth reading, nobody writes a book they want no one to read.
Right.
So I think for the most part, that's the challenge for all of us. And yes, I do get tired about talking about my work, but I don't get tired about talking about Jesus. So this has
Into
been
that.
it's still a joy.
Well, it shows, and I appreciate your passion so much, and I think I try to join you in that as well. So, and I can sympathize with the book. I'm a
Yes.
year out now, and know I'm kind of finally settling down and thinking I don't have any other things. I can actually relax and work on my prayer
Yes.
life and do some other book
Yes.
reading. So it's nice.
Yes, absolutely.
So thank you for explaining how that wasn't circular reasoning. I think that will be helpful to others. My last question just has to do with a later chapter in the book. I wanted to make sure I ask this. Chapter 10 deals again with kind of myth, but you talk about the idea of merged, modified, or mentioned. And I thought this was very compelling, that other religions, even pre-Christian religions, have either merged, modified, or mentioned, or even combination of all three, elements from Christianity. So religions that came before Christianity have done this, even in the present day, and that religions that came after, you think of Baha'i, and you think of Islam and others that you talk about in your book, have either merged, modified, or mentioned from Christianity. And I think that especially for the first part, people are scratching their head thinking, well, how did they do that if they didn't know about Jesus? And so I'd love for you to talk just a little bit about that for a few minutes.
Yeah, and you talked about this earlier when you said, why is it that sometimes it feels like, well, of course, we're kind of myopic in the sense that we're in a Christian culture largely, and wondering why. I think it's any theistic belief, any belief in a God that requires you to bend your knee. This is the difficulty with our worldview. Our worldview starts with an act of submission. And we're trying to sell that worldview to a world of young people who have learned to craft everything on their own autonomy. I can pick the kinds of entertainment I want to watch, when I want to watch it, the kind of news I want to consume, when I want to consume it, and how I want to consume it. I am in complete control of my schedule. That wasn't true for me growing up. If you didn't watch that show on ABC and you missed it on Thursday night, you better try to catch it in 26 weeks in the first repeat. After that, you might not see it at all.
Right.
It's on their schedule, not on your schedule. We have
Sure.
conditioned an entire culture to think that everything is under their control and power. Then we're introducing a worldview that starts with an act of submission. Why would we be surprised? This is a difficult worldview to embrace at this point in history.
Okay.
And I think part of the reason why Jesus is at the focal point, is at the kind of the bullseye of the discussion, is this issue we're talking about now. It turns out that, of course, why would you be surprised that anything that follows Jesus in the historic timeline, Islam, Ahmadi Islam, Muslims, Baha'i, any of these worldviews that follow the theistic worldviews that appear in history following Christianity, well, they all mention Jesus in some way. Jesus is on the pages of the scripture of Ahmadi Muslims, the Quran. He's on the pages of the writings of Baha'u'llah, the prophet of Baha'i faith. He ends up, because of course you have to deal with Jesus. He's already here and he's occupying a lot of space. But it turns out that even the religions that preceded Jesus, Buddhism, Hinduism, they worshipped Indra, they worshipped Zoroaster, they worshipped Attis, they worshipped Mithras, they worshipped Heracles long before they ever worshipped Jesus. But when those things moved into the common era, when they had to exist alongside Christianity, they began to merge or modify their practices to embrace the person of Jesus. These gods started to sound more like Jesus. These worshipers started to worship their deities like Mithras in a fashion that was very similar to the way that Christians worshiped. Why? Because the influence of Jesus is that dramatic. Yeah. Everyone at some point will merge, modify, or mention Jesus. If you're a Muslim, you know something about Jesus from the writings of your scripture. If you're a Buddhist, Buddhists revere Jesus as an enlightened teacher on the way to Buddhahood. These are folks who believe that there's a place for Jesus within Hinduism. There's a place for Jesus within the Baha'i faith. He's on the scripture. There's a place for Jesus within Buddhism. And the other religions modify their practices to resemble Christianity in some way. Meanwhile, Jesus says, no, it's just me.
Yeah.
And although he comes after Buddha, Indra, Hinduism, Zoroaster, all of these things, he knew about. No, I am the way, the truth, and the life, and except through me, no one comes to the Father. That is the claim. It's not so much that his claims are dramatic, because everyone's religious claims are dramatic. It's that his claims are exclusive. Is that everyone hat tips Jesus, but Jesus doesn't return the favor to anybody.
Exactly.
Now, and it's not only that, it's just that also that every other system, every other theistic system argues that you can attain the best that God has for you. And I say it that way because it depends on the system.
Yeah.
The best that God has for you might be to be united with God in heaven. It might be to be reincarnated in a certain form. It might be to achieve nirvana. Whatever it is, the best that God has for you, those systems argue that you have to do something to earn it.
Yep.
But not Jesus. Jesus says, no, it's just the opposite.
Exactly.
He stands apart from every other suspect in the suspect pool. And that's when that typically happens. And I've had cases. I had a case where I think I had 6 or 7 potential suspects aside from the one we finally arrested.
Wow.
And to get to that one, we had to figure out what made him special. What is he? How is he different? He's got a different level of anger toward our victim, a different level of access to our victim, a different level of ability to create the very weapon that was used to kill our victim. There's something unique about this guy compared to the other 7. And when you find that unique one that stands out from the rest, you probably have the right one.
Yeah.
And that's what you find with Jesus.
Wow. Yeah. And I have to say too, for those that might be struggling with this exclusivity, all truth claims are exclusive. I just told my students this reminded me of something else in our conversation I brought up earlier. I told my students, I said, even the inclusive truth claim of all religions are the same, they're all equally valid, all true. If it's true for you, it's true for you, fine. That itself excludes, because it excludes at least 2 massive world religions, including Islam and Christianity. It doesn't include, because if you take the claims of Christ seriously, that's not what he says. So if you're trying to be maximally inclusive with that religious pluralistic view, you've actually just excluded most religious people on planet Earth. So I wonder how we would work that one out rationally. So that's well said. And I love the suspect pool image. I think that's very, very helpful. So I have a couple of questions that have come in.
Okay.
And I want you to, be able to hear some of these. So first of all, from our little 7-year-old Lucas, is Bailey still with you? Do you still have, is this your dog, Bailey?
Yes, Bailey is being fed right now. I can hear that she just got her dinner. So she's outside eating dinner right now. But yes, I still have Bailey. She's 12. And for a corgi, that's getting pretty on and long in the tooth. So we'll see how long we have her, but she has been the best dog I've ever owned. And I think that you guys know about Bailey because of the book we wrote. I think it's Forensic Faith for Kids. We mentioned Bailey as part of the mystery. And in the second book, which is God's Crime Scene for Kids, we mentioned our cat Simba. Well, Simba, cats live a lot longer than corgis, so I'll probably have Simba for a number of years to come. But so we have both those. Simba and Bailey are still here in the house somewhere.
That's great. Lucas will be thrilled to hear that tomorrow. So we actually did Cold Case Christianity.
If I can get Bailey in here,
that'd be great. Yeah, that way he can watch this tomorrow. He's asleep now, of course, but that'd be great.
My wife is now bringing Bailey into the room so we can get this for Lucas.
That's great.
So we can show Lucas the dog here. She looks a lot older than she did as a puppy, of course. But I think corgis they age well. They're cute even to the very. Come here, girl.
Absolutely. Oh.
Let me hold you. Let me pick you up. Come here. Okay. Okay. So here she is. There she is. There's the famous.
Oh my gosh, we've learned so much about you.
Make sure that Lucas sees Bailey.
Yeah, so thank you so much for that. He's going to be thrilled.
Okay,
that's great. Well, that was my most important question.
Okay, you got Bailey.
Yeah, he'll be thrilled. And we actually did Cold Case Christianity for Kids first, then we did Forensic Faith.
Oh, good.
So we're going to go back and do God's Crime Scene. But I've
read all these books. Well, Simba's in that one, so you'll get a chance. I want to introduce you to Simba next. So.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thank you for doing that. So I have a friend, Dave Gilmore. I don't know if you're friends with him on social media as well, but we do some talking, and he's got a question. I didn't know this about you, and you mentioned it earlier. You have a background in architecture, is that right?
That's right. Yeah.
Okay, and so he follows you as well. So there's a part of you that's artistic. Obviously, if you are still an active architect, I don't know if you are or not. How would you use that creative spirit in making beautiful things to point people to God? I mean, I know that's kind of a big question, but I don't know, any thoughts on that for him?
I do have some thoughts on that now. I would say that there's a period of time in architecture, of course, it's long gone, called modernism. When I was working in architecture in the 1980s, we were already in the postmodern movement. All philosophical worldviews seem to precede, to end up first in the arts. And this is not. This is also common for Christianity, for the postmodernist worldview. For the most part, it was dead in the arts by 1990, but it was very much alive in the arts in the 1980s. And what made postmodernism interesting as an art form was the rather pluralistic view, right? Kind of like we see in culture today.
Yep.
And also the identification of iconic shapes. So modernism says all form follows function. If your building is being built with glass and steel, there's no reason to put cornices and architectural features and trinkets on the building. Just have it be the steel construction and the glass construction that is responsible for holding the building up. Yeah. And that's why you see a lot of modernist buildings are just steel and glass.
Right.
Now, what postmodernism says is, well, I don't think we should have been jettisoned all the forms that have iconic meaning. And it reintroduces the forms of, like, how do you know what is the iconic form of a door, of an entry point? And for years, for thousands of years, you knew how to enter a building based on the iconic shapes of the entry.
That's right.
So what postmodern does is seek to come back and restore to the language, to restore to the. So I would say that for me as a Christian now, I want to honor the fact that we are designed in the image of God. And there should be something about our architecture that reflects the image of God as seen in the human form. This is why I think you see the doorways are comfortable when they are proportioned for human entrance. They're going to be taller than they are wide. And we recognize this as most homes, for example, we might have double doors, but for the most part, one opens. And you open the one to go in because you really are honoring the shape of the human form. Wow. So I think what I would do if it was me as a Christian, and I'm not working in architecture anymore, is I would be trying to express and use those forms that honor the shape that God has given us, that reflect the image of God as seen in humans. Yeah, that's just me. That means I would probably move away from a more modernist view, a more abstract view, and move toward a more representational view of art, so that the human form that God has created is honored in the architecture.
Yeah, that's amazing. I think he's going to be thrilled with that answer. We've been doing a lot of talking about your book, and Dave, I just also wanted to say thank you too for he sent me a copy before my Amazon copies came in of your book.
Oh, good.
And so I was able to get it. He knew I was ready to feast on it, so he sent it to me. So I just wanted to say a special thank you to him. He's followed my podcast for a while, and just out of the kindness of his heart, sent that so I could read it in advance. So thank you, Dave. Awesome. Yeah, and great question and great answer. I think that's just about it. I'm really glad because you didn't know it, but earlier you really addressed when you talked about presuppositions. I shared with you I have a father-in-law who's worked in criminal defense law, and I really respect him. He's a really smart guy and has just such a great mind and asks all the right questions. I've learned so much from him, and I think what you had to say will be a subject of conversations to come. So you've actually kind of answered something we talked about last week. We got together at Disney and we chatted a bit. So whether you knew it or not.
Look at it this way, for your father-in-law, he's probably selected a lot of juries. And we always talk about what wins cases, what actually decides the outcome of cases. I don't want to say win or lose. Let's just say it decides the outcome.
Right.
It all starts in really kind of, to be honest, is dependent upon not the opening statements or the evidence show or the closing arguments or the rebuttal or even the jury deliberation. It starts with jury selection. I'm sure he's worked just as hard as we have to make sure that we have a jury in the box that is not so presuppositionally biased that they will not be fair.
Yeah.
But to be honest, we all have to ask ourselves that question. Do we come into this investigation unbiased? Or do we come in with some bias that we wouldn't even impanel ourselves as a juror for this case because we know we're not going to look at it fairly? We've already made our mind up. And one thing we don't do is put people in the box who've already made up their mind. So a lot of this is about, can we maintain that, still that hold that with an open hand.
Mhm.
Let's be honest about it. Most of us, I mean, like we know this when we select jurors. Every juror has got some type of presuppositional idea or notion
Yeah,
or bias.
of
The
course.
question is, can you suspend those biases long enough to be fair and make a decision here? And we ask
And
those kinds of questions of jurors as we select them.
yeah,
So I get that.
yeah,
So the question really for us as investigators of these claims of the Christian worldview
yeah.
is, are we somebody who we would even impanel on a jury?
Hmm.
Or are we at the point where we would, no, you know what? We
Not
don't even
this guy.
trust ourselves. So let's
Not
be
me.
honest about it, and then we'll go from there.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, that's been very helpful, I think, even to me. So thank you. I've thoroughly enjoyed this talk. Thank you so much for joining us,
Thanks
Detective
so much for
Wallace.
having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah.
I'm glad to be here.
Well, guys, we'll see you next year on 2022. So look forward to season 2. We really went out with a bang. So thank you and God bless. Merry Christmas.